Major Forrest Fenn and 3 wingmen briefed their mission with an intelligence officer. Both the Navy and the Air Force had recently lost planes near Chapone. They needed to mine its main road by dropping CBU-34. Fenn would lead the foreship while his wingmen held high, and Lieutenant James Swisher, forward air controller, provided oversight and coordination. This was programmed to be Major Fenn's 273rd mission, his last. It would take 2 passes, roughly at 200 feet. They scheduled the flight to be on target 30 minutes before sundown, in order to surprise the enemy on the first pass and pull up into the sun for protection on the second. To mine the road, Fenn would need to hold the airplane straight and level for 6 to 8 seconds. On the initial pass, Fenn saw smoke from anti-aircraft units on the side of the hill. He pulled up hard, turned back for the second pass, and expended the ordnance. Near the end of the second pass, ZPU Quad 4s sprayed a line of 50 caliber bullets in his path. Hit his nose, both drop tanks, and aft section. His canopy shattered. Large chunks of plexiglass hung in the frame. He looked out. There were bullet holes in his tanks, vapor everywhere. Fenn's dashboard lit up. Oil pressure, utility pressure, compression stall. Fisher, 7 miles away, radioed that Fenn was burning. Fenn knew his airplane wasn't getting him home, but he had a lot of airspeed and he knew the enemy's location. He quickly pulled up, did a 270-degree turn, fumbling for the gun switches. He didn't want to take his eyes off the target. He marked them with 20mm incendiary bullets and told the wingmen to take them out. He climbed with full power northeast out of Chapone toward the DMZ. Direction 030 degrees for bailout. Forrest didn't want to jump out at 4,000 feet and get shot in his parachute. He would aim for 1,000 feet at the most. He saw a bluff in the distance and thought it would be enemy-free and a good place to be rescued. He pulled his armrests up and jettisoned what remained of the canopy frame. His bailout procedure was in muscle memory. Remove gun camera film, zip it in G-suit. Put the Minox camera cord around left wrist. Throw tape recorder on the floor. Stow all loose gear. Fasten chin strap on helmet. Lower visor. Put heels in ejection seat stirrups. Push head back against headrest. Straighten back. Lift armrests to below the canopy. Close your eyes. He pulled the throttle back so the aircraft was barely flying and pulled both ejection triggers at once. His chute opened, and his plane careened into a stone bluff and exploded. He began working the risers to steer himself to the top of the bluff. The wind blew him toward his target, and he ended up just shy of it. The chute scraped the side of the rock face, and at about 150 feet his chute streamed, and he fell straight down to the jungle floor. He crashed through a web of limbs and thick branches. He shut his eyes. And when he opened them, he was 18 inches off the ground. He freed himself of his parachute and dragged his survival kit into a thick part of the jungle. He surveyed his injuries, only minor lacerations and a strained shoulder from bouncing off the bluff. He thought about pulling his parachute down from the trees, but it was getting dark, and he worried about finding his way back to his survival kit. He couldn't get the survival kit open, so he quickly used his flashlight and cut into it. Suddenly he was hot, sweating bullets. His heart pounded. He remembered what they told him in survival school in the Philippines. 100% of those shot down will go into shock. He lay down on the jungle floor, elevated his feet, closed his eyes, took deep breaths, and thought pleasant thoughts. He was fishing with his dad on the Lampasas River, catching 5-inch gills with a bobber and a worm. He also thought of a magical, peaceful waterfall that he'd seen many times. He sat on a damp, mossy log and wondered if the locator beacon in his parachute was working. He heard planes. He got on the radio and transmitted on guard channel, using his call sign, Kingfish. Forrest heard nothing, just static. Search planes were operating in an area about 15 miles away, and someone heard Kingfish. They didn't know where Forrest was, but they knew he was alive. Dogs barked in the distance, which meant the Pathet Lao were looking for him. He sprinkled pepper around his camp in a semicircle. Darkness descended all around him. Forrest figured he was in for the night. His ears were attuned to the sounds of the jungle. Scratching, things moving in the trees, monkeys or birds. He worried about tigers. There were cobras too. About midnight, there was a flash of light. Forrest figured the rescue squad was dropping parachute flares. And then the trees fell over. Hundreds of bombs detonated in the canyon. The sound was deafening. Forrest fell to the ground, covered his face. This was Operation Arclight. B-52s deployed from Guam, each bomber dropping over 100 500-pound Mark 82s from 30,000 feet. When everything stopped, Forrest couldn't hear, and it was dark again. And then gravel and sand rained down upon him. Forrest got on guard channel and tried calling them, told them to call off the next round. No response. Later that night, when the canyon lit up again, he cowered behind a log and braced himself. There was no sleeping. In a few hours, the sun would come up. Forrest figured that in the morning he had a choice to make. He could use his radio, bringing in personnel, which would put their lives at danger, or he could walk out. In survival school, they'd shown the debriefing film of a navigator who walked out in '66. Said he decided to be Tarzan, king of the jungle. Forrest took stock. He was in great shape, ran up and down the beaches at Tuiwa, graduate of survival school. He had a Randall knife, 2 pistols. There was fast running water, protein to eat everywhere. Figured he could make the South China Sea in 4 weeks. The challenge excited him. Once in a lifetime. But then he thought of Peggy and Zoe and Kelly. He couldn't do that to them. Forrest knew his friends would come get him. He began broadcasting at 5 a.m. But after nearly 3 hours of trying to communicate and getting no response, his hope was diminishing. Just before 8 a.m., Forrest heard the putt-putt of Fax Wisher's plane. He made radio contact immediately. "Where are you?" Fisher asked. "I want you to pop smoke so I can get your location." Forrest didn't like giving away his position. He spotted Swisher's plane through the trees and brought him close. "Roll into left bank. I'll tell you when." "Okay. Look down your left wing." There was Forrest's parachute. Swisher confirmed the location. "Okay, I've got you. Sit tight, Major." And he flew away. 20 minutes later, the sky was full of American aircraft. An enormous Crown C-130 circled at 15,000 feet. 2 Misty F-100Fs ran the outer perimeter. A Nail 02 and 4 heavily armed Sandy A-1 Sky Raiders were shooting up the jungle, providing cover for 2 Jolly Greens.
Jolly High, you're just about a half mile away from the survivor right now. Lift down and get due east. Now we're going down as fast as we can go. This thing will go any faster. Okay, for it, that's fine. Hey, guys, keep it open. Keep your eyes open. Okay, yeah, keep it moving.
The Highbird stood ready if needed while the pickup chopper, the Candy Ann, came in low and got Forrest on the radio. "Are you hurt?" "Negative." "Move away from the bluff." They dropped a jungle penetrator, and Forrest strapped himself in. They began hoisting him up through dense limbs. He lost his camera, lost his pistol. If he got snagged or if they took battle damage, Flight Engineer Master Sergeant Maples had his left hand on the cable cutter, just in case. But he cleared the canopy of trees and started up. Bob Sully swiveled the rocker arm once Fenn got to the chopper. He unstrapped Forrest and told him to sit on a flak vest in back. The chopper received minor damage from ground fire as it departed. Lieutenant James Swisher, the forward air controller who searched for Forrest until dark and was up at first light looking until he found him, did victory rolls all the way back to base. Forrest recommended Swisher for the Silver Star. An hour later, they landed at Nakhon Phanom, Thailand. Forrest was the 1,500th air crew to be rescued by the Air Service Rescue of Southeast Asia. So a couple of generals showed up. Newsreels were shot. Photographers snapped pictures. And they patched Forrest through to Lubbock so he could talk to Peggy. 3 days later, he walked through his own front door and greeted Peggy and Kelly and Zoe. It was Christmas Eve.
The National Broadcasting Company presents...
Flies aloft, watching the sky, watching the planes flying the lanes up above.
The 4th Fighter Command of the United States Army Air Forces presents this series of programs honoring the 150,000 volunteer civilian observers and filter center workers whose round-the-clock vigilance keeps watchful guard of the Pacific coast.
Forrest grew up with war reports on the family radio, heard stories of ace pilots shooting down Nazi planes. He sketched P-51s in his school notebook and dreamed of what it would be like to soar into the clouds. In this chapter, Forrest gets a small taste of military life, a uniform, corps drills, traditions, camaraderie. It's one last game of pretend, and it's enough to propel him into adulthood. Forrest graduated high school in the spring of 1947. That fall, he enrolled at Temple Junior College so he could play basketball for the Leopards. The fledgling institution didn't have its own campus until 1955. Students met in the high school building. To Forrest, it probably seemed merely like extra years tacked on to high school. He skipped a lot of classes and started failing. You pick up on his malaise and aimlessness early in Stout-Hearted Men. He says he lacked discipline and focus. He needed to get serious about something. Even the comfort of Yellowstone vacations apparently lost its appeal. Chapter 11 of Too Far to Walk says Forrest abandoned West Yellowstone for Sun Valley, Idaho. There's a photograph taken on Forrest's 20th birthday with the inscription, "15 days later I joined the Air Force." And I think our chapter happened inside that 2-week window in 1950. He tagged along with friends going to College Station about 80 miles east of Temple. He's issued a cadet uniform, pretends to take notes in class, plays touch football on the lawn, and gathers around the famous Aggie bonfire to sing and chant with the other young men. But it all came crashing down.
Cadet Fenn, report to finance.
He hurried to the barracks, packed up the few things he brought, and left. It's a funny little story, but it's also sad. He's crying because he's leaving this rich and memorable experience, but he's also crying because he doesn't have much to go back to, except Peggy. The photographs in each chapter of Forrest in uniform provide a link for readers. We see his graduation into adulthood, although he doesn't yet know what he's in for. Before we explore this important chapter, I want to quickly provide a timeline of events. The Fenns were a typical military family, moving around from base to base every few years, so it can be confusing. Here's a quick summary. In 1950, Forrest heads to Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio. He joins the Air Force and leaves for Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls for basic training. Much of 1951 was spent in radar mechanics school at Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi. They marched to class and put Forrest on the midnight shift. Now a buck sergeant, Forrest goes to Donaldson Air Force Base in Greenville, South Carolina to work as a radio operator. He didn't like it, and after a while he'd had enough. He marched into personnel and said, yeah, I'd like to be transferred to anywhere but here. The Air Force needed pilots, and Forrest was accepted into pilot training, which began with 6 months of primary training at Bainbridge Air Base in Georgia. He started with the T-6, then he was off to Laredo Air Force Station for basic training in the T-28 and T-33 jet. He graduated from pilot training in September with low marks in academics and very high marks in actually flying planes. 3 months later, 2nd Lieutenant Fenn married Peggy 2 days after Christmas, and they set up house in Mexico Beach, Florida, where he trained in the F-86D at Tyndall Air Force Base. This plane held the speed record at the time. Then it was off to Scott Air Force Base in Belleville, Illinois. Forrest joined the 85th Fighter Interceptor Squad. Through a connection here, Forrest became aide-de-camp to Major General Frank Robinson, who led crew training at Randall Air Force Base. The general told Forrest, "What I want you to do is fly as many airplanes as you can, so you can tell me what's going on with my airplanes." He flew the F-84G, the F-86D and F models, the F-89, the T-33, and the brand new F-100C. He even went off and graduated from helicopter training school in 9 days. Forrest was assigned to the 23rd Fighter Bomber Squadron at Bitburg Air Base in Germany. During his time here, his squadron was sent on temporary duty to Wheelus Air Base in Tripoli, where he got to fly with Robin Olds. Forrest took a position at Luke Air Force Base in Phoenix to teach at the gunnery school. His commander was Bill Weisner, who shot down 6 German fighters on one mission. A few years later, he taught pilot training in the T-38 at Reese Air Force Base in Lubbock. Then, in January 1968, Forrest heads off to jungle school in the Philippines, on his way to Tuiwa, Vietnam. So let's look at My War for Me. If you skim over it, glancing down at phrases, looking at the photographs, you'll probably get the wrong idea about this chapter. A retired fighter pilot is going to regale us with acts of heroism, specifically his own. But right off the bat, Forrest breaks the mold. He describes the Vietnam War as a manifestation of humankind's frailties, a terrible situation. He refers to the Commander-in-Chief's words about saving Vietnam from communist aggression. "I bought into that pretty good," he writes. He says world leaders are constantly bringing war and death. And he mentions the death toll: 58,266 Americans killed. That number has actually climbed since Forrest published his memoir. And he could have filled several pages with shocking statistics, somewhere between 1.5 and 3.5 million total deaths, well over 500,000 civilian deaths. Here we're introduced to one of the chapter's main ideas. Look at how the author circles around his thesis. The dead are memorialized, tears are shed. But what does it mean? What does it matter? The central ideas here are death, remembrance, and meaning. His statement about people's names being like asterisks in the history of a forgotten war takes us back to page 15, in which he said each of us will be nothing but the leftovers of history or an asterisk in a book that was never written. And it's not just Vietnam. The author's lens zooms out and he speaks to all wars. I'm reminded of Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA. A cursory listen and you think it's a patriotic anthem. But you look closer and realize it's a hard look at the devastating fallout of war. Forrest's view of war recognizes bravery and heroism. It also recognizes the enemy, and he did what he was asked. He dropped bombs, he mined roads, he shot up legitimate targets. He also draws a clear line between military and civilian personnel. The story of the funeral drives this home, and it reinforces his thesis about remembrance as a sacred duty. The people below were remembering a loved one, and it crushed him that he unwittingly terrorized them. So, will this chapter be about the lasting personal trauma of war? Some have speculated that this is a driving force in Forrest's life. No, he says he doesn't have bad dreams. He wasn't scarred, he says. And yet he may have been forever branded. He caps off this portion of the chapter with another reference to the Commander-in-Chief, as well as Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense who escalated the Vietnam conflict, but then later in life expressed deep regret for his choices. And that leads us into his story of how he ended up spending a harrowing night in enemy territory, over 400 miles away from the bed where he thought he'd be sleeping, his whereabouts temporarily unknown to the search party. But before he tells the story, he introduces us to the waterfall. Forrest mentioned these beautiful waterfalls in a May 6th recording.
The countryside is absolutely beautiful. Large waterfalls that are falling 150 and 200 feet, and I swear you can see them 150 miles away when you're climbing out to go to a target.
But there was one in particular that caught his eye. He says it appeared to him when the South China Sea was to his right, that is, he's heading north out of Tuiwa, and he was just finishing his climb out, reaching about 4,000 feet. The waterfall appeared ahead at 11 o'clock, so we know the general area. But he says it was remote and in enemy territory, an hour's ride by helicopter. But for whatever reason, Forrest is content to let some of this remain mysterious. Look at the language Forrest uses to describe this place, to describe his relationship to this place. He says he made a vow to the waterfall. They had a deal. There was trust between the two of them. They shared this secret, and upon many return visits, he renewed the vow. If this were an object, we would call it a fetish or a talisman. He said this place held magic. It became his personal sacred space. The deal he struck with the waterfall was, you bring me back safely from this mission, which could have been a mission as early as January or February, and I'll come down there and personally thank you. Forrest didn't pay his debt to the waterfall because he survived his night in Laos. He was obligated to visit after the waterfall brought him back safely that first time. And then he continued to borrow against the original pledge, renewing the vow, mission after mission, incurring an enormous debt. The relationship was all one-sided. So when he almost doesn't come back on his last mission, his mind, quite naturally, went to the waterfall. After a night like that, after a tour like that, he absolutely had to visit the waterfall. By the way, when Forrest says shot down twice during his tour, it can be confusing. You might imagine something like this, twice. Shot down twice means 2 incidents in which enemy fire made a scheduled return to base impossible. But other than that, the circumstances were different. This sacred place looked magical from 4,000 feet, but it was impersonal and disappointing close up. Walking through thick grass, Forrest tripped over a grave marker, and then they found more. The names were French, and the dates suggested young men who died in 1947. The presence of both aluminum and stone grave markers suggests a location site used multiple times over the years. Forrest turned over the one he tripped over and found the inscription. Something very similar to this appeared in the December 1921 edition of The Smart Set, published by H.L. Mencken. How it got on a grave marker in Southeast Asia is anyone's guess. No need to get tripped up that it was in English. There had been English speakers here for decades. OSS, diplomats, and Forest Service personnel, missionaries, and then of course foreign soldiers. Operation Masterdom brought thousands of British soldiers to Vietnam in 1945. Some have tried to connect the cemetery here to a French task force called Groupement Mobile 100, Mobile Group 100. They suffered a terrible defeat when they were ambushed at Mengyang Pass, about 85 miles northwest of Tuiwa. When you consider the constraints of a round-trip Army helicopter ride on one take of gas, it begins to feel like you've got a strong lead. But that attack happened on June 24, 1954, 7 years after 1947. But what this demonstrates is that an English-speaking presence and a tradition of makeshift foreign burial sites were commonplace. In fact, the French government, beginning in the mid-80s, began repatriating the remains of French citizens buried in Vietnam and interring them at the Indochina Memorial in Fréjus in southern France. This article here mentions 833 return, but says the remains of 25,000 people from multiple cemeteries needed to be exhumed and brought home. What's important to our story is that upon reading this inscription, Forrest felt that he had kept his promise. There wasn't a sense of closure, however, because he needed to unravel the significance of this event. He had questions. In fact, Forrest had many questions. They start on page 95 and they characterize the rest of the chapter. It looks like this. For the first 21 pages of the chapter, there are no philosophical questions, but in the last 8, there are 25, about 3 per page. The important issues raised earlier pertain to death, remembrance, and meaning. So here come the questions, and the first one is a doozy. Is it fair? In the Old Testament, this is the question that got Job in trouble. But Forrest doesn't seem to be challenging God. He seems to be speaking to the circle of humanity. Specifically, is it fair that no one remembers where those French soldiers fell? He adds, save by me. He came across the grave marker. He read the name. Now he alone carries the memory. Suddenly he's whisked away by helicopter. He's taken home to Lubbock, and it's jingle bells and auld lang syne and the doorbell ringing with sweet people coming over with casseroles to say, welcome home. No time to think about a philosophy of life. Come January, Forrest is back at Reese, teaching pilot training classes. And I'm guessing his lectures have a little more gravitas. When it comes time to illustrate a point, Forrest can close the textbook. The following year, Forrest is reminded that he flew from Newfoundland all the way down the eastern seaboard to North Carolina. And once again, we have a seemingly unimportant incident that sticks in Forrest's mind, this time covering Philadelphia with his thumb. It took him to another dimension in his mind. You'd be forgiven if you thought my war for me is mainly about the time Forrest's plane was shot down. It takes up a lot of real estate in the chapter, and it's undoubtedly a significant thing in his life. But here Forrest makes it clear that it's mainly the grave marker incident and the Philadelphia story that caused him to do some serious soul-searching. And this time, with Philadelphia, he's added another element to his thesis. Before it was a meditation on death and remembrance, now he's adding the value of the individual. On page 99, he briefly mentions his rewards for service, medals and honors. They later added up to a big empty, he says. He even suggests that when it's his turn to die, he should get a rebate for his year in Vietnam, suggesting it didn't count, that it was a waste. This is heavy stuff, but this is preface. Forrest is getting to his conclusions, but he's letting us know that it has nothing to do with glory in battle. It is not simply the grim reality of death that is weighing on Forrest. It's that these soldiers experience a second death in not being remembered. All their affections and aspirations have died, which is a tragedy. But the fact that no one can remember their names, that is unconscionable, the real tragedy. Forrest is trying to write a holistic philosophy of existence and meaning. No wonder he turns to poetry, specifically Omar Khayyam. Look at how Omar Khayyam has been depicted in artists' renderings, and you can see why his name is often synonymous with hedonism. But Khayyam doesn't advocate recklessness and thoughtless pleasure-seeking. Instead, he looks at life's brevity and says we should not apologize for sensual enjoyment. Wine, song, companionship, beauty, laughter, love. Carpe diem, seize the day. They didn't have bananas in Persia, but if they had, he would have written poems about grabbing every one. As far as I can tell, these verses are not successive. Forrest has made his own playlist. And he says he's drawn to the darker verses. Indeed, these 3 quatrains are about the finality of death and humankind's inability to do anything about it. Whether your religious zeal is characterized by certainty or blind faith, the poet says you're a fool for postponing all your pleasures and rewards until the afterlife. What comes next is surprising. I doubt we could find another author who has ever linked Omar Khayyam, Andy Warhol, and Shakespeare. Warhol said in the future everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes. This allusion might seem incongruous, but it plays into Forrest's thesis. Fame, in this context, guarantees remembrance. With recognition comes an assurance that you won't be forgotten. Then he quotes Shakespeare, but he's only interested in one aspect of the quotation: the idea of playing your part and taking your bow and exiting as the curtain falls. This flows right out of the first and third quatrains that Forrest quoted above. Each person, he says, has faded like the smell of a dying daffodil. No sooner does one depart than another takes its place, again and again, only for the same fate to befall. This has echoes of the book of Ecclesiastes. And not surprisingly, Solomon, or whoever wrote Ecclesiastes, also meditated on the idea of remembrance. He lamented the same thing as Forrest. No one remembers, and the next generation, they won't remember either. Our author returns to the idea of fame with a quote from Longfellow. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing, leave behind us footprints in the sands of time. Forrest asks, but what about those of us who are not great men? Are we not somehow entitled to leave a slight footprint somewhere? The impulse to be remembered might even manifest in the actions of Lee Harvey Oswald or John Wilkes Booth. Anything to gain immortality. In the face of these sobering realities about life's transience and our being forgotten, some have said life is meaningless. Some have despaired. Many live in denial of these realities, prefer not to think about things that are so morbid. Or they escape in entertainment or fantasy. Some numb their pain. And then, of course, many find refuge in religion. No wonder every faith since the dawn of time speaks directly to these existential quandaries. Now might be a good time to reflect on what My War for Me is not. It's not an endorsement of religion. There's hardly a mention of God, and no religious texts are quoted. It's not even an advertisement for some of the main things that religion endorses. Faith, the word faith is not here. It's not an endorsement of hope, enduring life's trials now, knowing that things will get so much better in the afterlife. No, he never talks about that. It's not a prescription for one's impending demise, a way to deal with death. This chapter is not about how to die, it's about how to live. And this chapter is obviously not advocating denial or fantasy or escape. So if Forrest is not recommending any of these things, what is his response after staring into the void? He begins with the issue of fame. It really doesn't matter who we are if we are someone to ourselves. No one else can think my thoughts, so I am myself only to me. To be important, I only need to impress myself. How does that happen? What makes people proud of themselves? Forrest implies that we are social creatures, connected to our fellow human beings, and we feel the best about ourselves when we connect with others in positive ways, affirm them, help them, show kindness and generosity. But why does this matter? Aren't we just like flowers that flourish and then die somewhere high on a mountain where no one sees? If you live, die, and are forgotten, how are we any different from these flowers? Forrest says he finally arrived at a satisfying answer about his desire to be remembered, the forget-me-not syndrome. He says no one has to see. The grass sees, and the trees and rushing waters of the spring creek also see. I think what he's saying is that he's been looking at it all wrong. Fame doesn't confer greatness upon a person. Admiration doesn't make a person admirable. Standing in front of a mirror doesn't cause you to appear there. You are who you are, and perception doesn't alter that reality. What has made me think that I had to see the beauty that is there in order to confirm its existence? He returns to the two incidents that drove him to consider all this in the first place, the stone marker in Philadelphia. Here were lessons about treating individuals with dignity and kindness, taking us back to the idea of impressing ourselves, that is, cooperating with our deepest drives as human beings. We are all here only for the pleasure of others, everything living, only for the pleasure of others. If I cannot enrich those with whom I interact each day and cause them to be better for my having passed their view, then I have wasted my turn. But an aspiration like that seems so enormous. It's like hiking Everest. It's too big, so you never start. So what do you do if your life motto is help humanity? Forrest says it really comes down to daily interactions, causing a smile. And it begins with the smallest circle in your life, the people who live under your roof. He says that his round-the-world, 50 years in the making philosophy of life can be seen in the way he cheers his wife with a kiss on the cheek, a kind word, holding the door open for her, being on time when she's expecting him. Honoring her in a dozen small ways adds up to a lifetime of service and love. And if he's forgotten after he's gone, that's all right, he says. If no one should ever think of me when I have passed this veil, it will be of no consequence, for I have finally found my way and am at peace with all of it. It's a remarkable thing when an artist walks up to a blank canvas and with pigment and brushstrokes transforms it into something meaningful, something that resonates with those who see it. And it's the same thing with a writer who stares at a blinking cursor on a blank computer screen. It can be a monumental task to write almost anything that you show to others. How much more if you're challenged to sum up what you really believe about life's ultimate meaning? Not many people can take the various strands of thought that have spun out from their experiences, good and bad, and weave together a tapestry that has shape and pattern. Few people give serious thought to these ideas. Fewer still write 10,000 words on the subject. I think it takes guts to put yourself out there, to share your sincere beliefs about life's most urgent questions. In some ways, I think it takes more bravery than surviving a night in the jungle. Khayyam's Rubaiyat was a rejection of trite religious dogma. Since human existence is transient, it's best to savor life's exquisite moments while you can. This begins with cultivating a sense of presence and awareness, so you can fully appreciate your short time on Earth, connect in meaningful ways to your fellow travelers, and try, in your little corner of the world, to be a source of kindness and encouragement.